I would like to welcome everyone to this high-level panel on accountability to affected populations. I'm Charles-Antoine Hoffman, working with UNICEF, but here in my capacity of supporting the work of the IASC Results Group on accountability and inclusion. I will just go briefly through very practical things before handing over to Mervat. We are recording the session. I hope it's all right with everyone, but that's important. We want to make sure that we make it available for those who cannot attend. So that's just for your information. Please mute yourself. We are quite a large number of participants, so having background noises can be distressful. So let's be disciplined with this. And also we suggest to those who are not speaking to turn the video off, as I can see you doing already. And obviously, please feel free to turn it on when you intervene. We will be monitoring the chat box for questions, comments, etc. So please use it. And if you want to take the floor when there will be space for discussions or questions, indicate if you want to speak. We want this session to be as lively as possible. And without further ado, let me introduce MervatShelbaya, who is going to be the session facilitator. And I'm very pleased that Mervat accepted to do that. You'll be definitely in very good hands. Mervat is the head of the Interagency Standing Committee Secretariat, appointed by the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator. And in this role, Mervat is playing a critical function in terms of supporting both UN and non-UN humanitarian partners in terms of operational, policy, and advocacy issues in support of strengthening humanitarian action at field or country level. Mervat is also the director of OCHA's Interagency Support Branch, which is the branch providing support to humanitarian coordinators so that we can ensure that the humanitarian operations are led as it should be. And Mervat has over 20 years of experience in humanitarian affairs, both at global and field levels. And let me straight hand over to you, Mervat. Back to you.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Charles-Antoine. Good morning to you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to colleagues online. Welcome, of course, to this really, really important session, this discussion on delivering on our accountability to affected people, delivering on our AAP commitments. And this is really an opportunity to look at lessons learned and look at good practices in addressing barriers to AAP within the system. I'm truly honored to be moderating this session, and I'm really pleased that we're joined today by a great panel to kickstart this discussion, but also share important findings and the respective experiences on the barriers to collective AAP, but also on the opportunities for us to make a step change in translating our AAP commitments and aspirations to meaningful action and change. Mr. Oliver Lough is a research fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group with ODI, with a background in needs assessment and monitoring and evaluation. His research interests are focused on humanitarian accountability, communicating with crisis-affected populations, and evidence-based decision-making processes in emergencies. Today, Oliver will have the opportunity to speak to us about some of the key findings and recommendations from a recently published report. I believe it was published October 2020, titled Implementing Collective Accountability to Affected Populations, Ways Forward in Large-Scale Humanitarian Crises. Welcome, Oliver. We're also joined by Ms. Vasiti Soko. Welcome, Vasiti. Vasiti is the director of Fiji's National Disaster Management Office. She is a champion of inclusivity and also co-chairs the Pacific Technical Working Group on Human Mobility and the Pacific Response to the Disaster Displacement Advisory Board. Vasiti also serves as Deputy Chair for Asia Pacific TWG on disaster-related statistics, and she has more than 15 years of experience in geospatial science. Welcome again, Vasiti. Really honored that you were able to join us. We're also joined today by Ms. REGINA Nanette SALVADOR-ANTEQUISA. She is the founding executive director of Ecosystems Work for Essential Benefits, ECOWEB for short. This is a national development and humanitarian organization based in the Philippines. Nanette has over 30 years of experience in peace, development, and humanitarian work in the Philippines, and she is the convener of the community-led Emergency Action Response Network, ClearNet, and a national representative of the Victims and Disaster and Calamity Sector to the government's National Anti-Poverty Commission. Again, welcome, Nanette, to today's session, and we look forward to your interventions. We also have with us today Mr. Emanuele Copobianco. Emanuele is the Director of Health and Care at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC. He leads IFRC's Global Health and Care team, which provides strategic and operational support to 192 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. He also leads IFRC's technical response to COVID-19 and has been the emergency coordinator for the Ebola outbreaks in DRC. Previously, he also had the opportunity to work with the Global Fund, the World Bank, UNICEF, and WHO. Welcome, Emanuele. I'm glad you could join us today. And last but definitely not least, I'm really pleased that we are joined today by Ms. Kristen Knutson. Kristen is the head of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. She's the head of the Office of OCHA in Burkina Faso. She has nearly 20 years of experience with the United Nations in the field of humanitarian affairs and has held various positions with OCHA in the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Haiti, and Uganda, as well as UN headquarters in New York. Welcome, Kristen, and welcome to all of our panelists, and really, really look forward to today's discussions and your interventions. Now, colleagues, this is an important and exciting time to be engaging in discussions and considering ways to strengthen our collective accountability to the millions of the most vulnerable around the world that we are here to serve. But as we do so, it is really important to acknowledge the extraordinary efforts undertaken in recent years, including from many of you here at this forum and many of those who joined us today, to ensure communities are indeed at the center of humanitarian action. Since the launch of the Grand Bargains Participation Revolution at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, 5 years ago now, we've moved a long way in acting upon our commitments to affected people so that the system is held to account by the people we work to serve, assist, and protect. In addition to the critical work done by yourselves and the various organizations and stakeholders around the world, at the Interagency Standing Committee, there is renewed drive, effort, and commitment to build the necessary blocks to strengthen the system's collective accountability to affected people. And I'll speak to some of the critical work being done under the auspices or the umbrella of the IASC later on in the session. If I may ask, I believe someone has their phone unmuted, and so there's a little bit of an echo that I can hear myself. So if colleagues can just be reminded to please mute their phones, that would be excellent. So, but again, as clearly outlined in recent surveys with affected people and also the ODI report, which Oliver will speak to shortly, clearly there is a lot more that needs to be done to strengthen our collective ability to better listen and respond to affected people, safeguard their dignity, and ensure their meaningful engagement in decisions that directly affect them. So critical attention and momentum is being built to effect the required shifts, including some of you may have seen the recent call from the Emergency Relief Coordinator, who is, again, the chair of the Interagency Standing Committee and also the Undersecretary General for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the recent call, which he announced yesterday, for the creation of an independent commission into voices in crisis, which seeks to ensure or look at systematic and transparent and public assessment and evaluation of our collective ability to indeed respond to the needs of the most vulnerable in the most efficient way. We must build on and capitalize on this unique attention and momentum. And that's why I'm extremely pleased and excited about today's session to build upon the great work that's been done over the course of the past years to make sure that we continue to strengthen our collective response and accountability to affected people. Perhaps with that, I'd like to turn to our panelists, starting with Oliver. Oliver, as mentioned earlier, again, thank you for joining us, and it would be great to kickstart today's panel discussion by sharing some of the key lessons and findings from the ODI report, which was published a few months ago on collective AAP approaches. So perhaps with that, over to you, please, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Mervat. I'm really honoured to have the opportunity to be able to share the findings of our research with you. I believe Marcella has some slides that will accompany this presentation, so if she would be able to share the screen, that is fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, next slide, please. So I'd like to just start by going over the work that we did on this research project that is looking specifically at the idea of collective approaches to community engagement and accountability in humanitarian action. And we did this in 2019 and 2020 at a time when collective approaches had been used kind of increasingly throughout the humanitarian system since the early 2010s, but hadn't quite yet bedded down in a sort of systematic way across the system. So we wanted to look at what the bottlenecks were around this and look at what the opportunities were for sort of more systematic and predictable implementation of these approaches. So we did 5 case studies that kind of aim to look at how approaches were happening in a range of different contexts. So these are all on our website, but just very briefly, we looked at protracted conflict settings in CAR and Yemen. We looked at natural hazard-related disasters in the Mozambique Idai response and the Indonesia Sulawesi earthquake, and we looked at a complex public health emergency in the DRC Ebola crisis. Next slide, please. So just to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about a collective approach to communication and community engagement, and I'll use communication and community engagement interchangeably with AAP. Please understand it to mean the same thing. So this is our understanding of what a collective approach should look like, and it's based on previous research and guidance, but also what we were seeing in practice. And the key thing to sort of take into account here is that it's something that cuts across and is owned by the entire response. It ideally involves a multiple range of actors, from sort of senior UN leadership down to affected communities themselves and ideally host governments. And it's sort of involves multiple mechanisms, so ways to collect feedback, ways to speak to affected communities, and it's focused on really improving the way responses as a whole strengthen two-way communication with affected communities. So providing information, getting information, closing the feedback loops, and ultimately this is with the aim of kind of shifting the dial on the response, making responses more responsive and accountable to the needs of the people they're serving. And it's really important to acknowledge that these mechanisms don't exist separately from individual agency or program accountability systems. The idea is that they sort of build on them and pull them together and work in a complementary way with them. In terms of why it's important to do things collectively as well as just at the individual agency level, there's a couple of key reasons. First of all, it improves the efficiency and the effectiveness of a response. So it's a way to make complementary use of the strengths and coverage of different agencies. It can minimize and identify gaps. It can make things more efficient. It can kind of lower the barrier to entry for potentially quite expensive ways of talking to and addressing community needs. And it can give the response as a whole a more comprehensive understanding of kind of cross-cutting needs of the community. But it's also a really important way to make responses more coherent and more legible to affected people themselves. So, for example, it's a way to make feedback systems much more easy to navigate by streamlining them and sort of making them, centralized. It's a way to make sure that messaging gets to the right people in the right language in ways that are culturally appropriate and have been properly tested. Ideally, it's a way of making sure that people, including those who are most marginalized and vulnerable, can also have multiple entry points to provide feedback and complain to the system. And finally, it's a really important way to allow people to engage humanitarians around what's important to them, rather than sort of within silos or programming. So, you know, people being able to talk about their needs rather than just being able to talk to food security people about food or shelter people about shelter and so on. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that we found is right now that there is still an implementation gap in terms of how collective approaches are sort of being thought of in policy and guidance and what's happening on the ground, which is still kind of quite patchy and quite unpredictable. And we found a number of key reasons for this, and I'll take you through the main ones now. So the first thing to note is that there is still a lack of common understanding, both around accountability, AAP in general, and collective approaches specifically. And in terms of the accountability stuff in general, like while this can just be a question of semantics, it can also really result in sort of parallel structures and people working at cross purposes. And kind of the most extreme example in DRC and elsewhere is sort of accountability to affected populations, communities, and humanitarian work, and risk communication communities and public health work kind of occasionally working at cross purposes and sort of leading to more confusion rather than coherence. And in terms of collectives, what we found is that a lot of people weren't really clear about kind of what a collective approach was meant to look like or do, and that there was quite a lot of focus on common services as being a collective approach. So sort of, you know, running a common hotline and calling it a day, which is good, but it is quite narrow in terms of the definition we've talked about of kind of trying to involve the response and trying to involve multiple mechanisms. Another really key issue that we found was a lack of senior level buy-in and commitment to collective approaches. And as one of our informants said, this is really important because top-down commitments are a way to enable bottom-up feedback to move through the system. So we found that humanitarian coordinators and country teams weren't always clear on kind of what a collective approach was meant to be and sort of what their or other people's responsibilities were around it. And this kind of has a knock-on effect on how effective collective approaches can be. So without a clear guidance on sort of who's meant to be facilitating the approach, kind of what it's meant to be focusing on, and what the strategy is, you can end up with bits and pieces of common services that don't kind of really come together into a coherent whole, and that there's no one really mandated to identify where there are gaps or what's missing. So the whole can end up less than the sum of its parts. But another real problem here is you can also have collective approaches that are kind of siloed down into a technical forum with a sort of a narrow range of actors working on them, generating a lot of really rich information and feedback, but they don't have a way to connect to kind of important decision-making processes that can move the dial on the response. And that sort of results in feedback loops not being closed. So there's a need for more kind of legitimate spaces for thinking about and acting on information that these collective approaches generate in a way that plugs into high-level decision-making processes. Money is also a problem, and specifically not having enough of the right kind of money. So kind of reflecting the lack of common understandings around collective approaches in general, we found quite a fragmented donor landscape. So different donors having different understandings and different priorities and funding bits and pieces here and there, but kind of nothing coherent on how to fund a collective approach in the way, for example, donors kind of have got together on cash. Collective approaches are also quite cheap, as we'll talk about in a second, which means they're quite fiddly to fund directly. And that this can result in ways of funding that kind of concentrate power in a small number of hands, and you can have and end up with the sort of the same big agency coordinating, implementing, and subgranting an approach. And this can lead to approaches that sort of have the form of a collective, but actually don't sort of foster the sort of collaborative spirit that's needed to really make them work. And a final point on funding is quite often these things are still funded not at scale and on sort of short-term pilot basis, which is a big problem as it takes time to sort of build legitimacy, to build relationships and to begin to influence the response. And having these set up as pilots sort of sets them up for failure. And a final, and arguably the most important one that is not unique to collective approaches is a lack of local ownership and local leadership in collective approaches. And what we found was that there's a tendency for the way in which collectives are facilitated at the moment to have them quite deeply embedded within the technocratic humanitarian coordination architecture. They tend to be owned and dominated by UN agencies or big INGOs. And we didn't really see any examples of collectives in internationally led responses having a really strong presence of local actors. This means that there are a lot of local actors who have, strong networks and long relationships on the ground, that are either excluded from the coordination system or don't see the value in plugging in, or the coordination system doesn't see the value in what they're doing because it doesn't quite conform to the jargon or the idea of what community engagement should look like. And the value of their work often goes unrecognized. There are good examples of this happening in preparedness settings where there hasn't been an emergency yet. So I'm sure our colleague in Fiji will speak to this, but there's been work done by the CDAC network on sort of strengthening collective approaches for preparedness. But there does seem to be kind of a broken link between approaches that are launched during an emergency and being able to sort of sustain them through into the preparedness phase. And that's a really important one, because if you can do a lot of this stuff before an emergency happens, you're not then having to play catch up in the first 2 months of emergency, setting up all of your systems and building all of your relationships. Next slide, please. So despite these blockages, there is quite a strong potential enabling environment to take collective approaches forward. So there is a perception widespread among the people we talk to that a collective approach makes sense and is a necessary addition. Even if people weren't kind of familiar with the idea, it's something that people generally intuitively get, and there wasn't a lot of pushback on it. We also did a quick cost analysis, and to the extent that collective approaches incur specific costs rather than sort of being mainstreamed across agency program budgets, they are pretty cheap, and we found that they generally come in at well under 1% of the cost of a humanitarian response plan when they're budgeted for. So in terms of kind of what they can offer a response, this is pretty cheap. There's also just a kind of a general background, an increasing background buzz around collective approaches. So there's like a lot of strong policy and guidance. CDAC Network have done a huge amount of work on this. There's our research. We're really excited about IASC's Results Group 2 on the accountability framework that they're working on, which can hopefully provide kind of more tangible building blocks for approaches for senior leadership. There's also a lot of really strong specialist organizations that have become increasingly prominent in recent years that are working on these things and can provide these key common services, so sort of like Translators Without Borders and language, for example. And there is a strong policy framework. So our collective approach has been in humanitarian country team TORs since 2017. And it's, built on increasingly strong commitments across the sector to accountability more widely. And, as Merivat mentioned, it's in the grand bargain, it's in the reform agenda, and we'll be really interested to see how this goes in whatever comes after the grand bargain. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to conclude on where we can possibly go next. And the key starting point that we want to emphasize in our recommendations is collective approaches are going to look different in different places, depending on the needs of the crisis, the actors involved, the different capabilities, kind of how people are aligned. And so we wanted to try and build our recommendations around kind of the principles that you need to make a collective approach effective, regardless of the specific form or model that it takes. And one warning here is that kind of over-architecturing a collective approach and kind of trying to over-design it at the start can kind of result in its collapsing under its own weight before it really gets started. So kind of the key thing is to get moving on it as quickly as possible. So the principles we're looking at are that obviously leadership needs to commit strongly and commit early, and approaches will continue to be ad hoc and unpredictable if this doesn't happen. So start with a strong commitment, build out from there. They also need to have a really clear link with decision-making forums, and ideally they need to not kind of create yet another parallel structure, but build on what's already there. So how can this kind of be mainstreamed into the work of the HCT, be mainstreamed into the work of an assessment working group or other relevant forums. It also really needs to build on and complement the accountability mechanisms of individual agencies. If there's a strong existing network of actors on the ground, consider how you can bring their inputs into a feedback mechanism. If there's a really good hotline, how can that be expanded to the response? So, thinking about strengthening and kind of coordinating what's already there rather than necessarily having kind of a flashy new system and a flashy new dashboard. This can also be a good way of identifying where there are genuine gaps that do need new activities. Who facilitates a collective approach is also really important. So quite often these things end up being facilitated by people with really strong technical skills, but who don't necessarily have the political skills to make sure that information is well analysed and it feeds into decision making in a way that it's acted upon. So both technical skills and political savvy are needed, and a perception of neutrality. So it can't just be seen to be sort of one representing one agency or one group within the response. This is really important because another thing that comes out is that a collective approach, and it really needs to be owned by the response. Everyone needs to see it as something that they can buy into and contribute to, and is part of the landscape, rather than like, oh, that's OCHA's thing, or that's the community engagements working groups thing. It's not our problem, because that kind of results in you know, a lack of things to feed into it and a lack of buy-in to the information it's providing. It's also critical that there is a much stronger element of local leadership and local engagement. So people facilitating these approaches need to find potentially creative ways to bring local knowledge into the discussion, especially if it's hard or exclusionary. And ideally, especially in natural hazard related settings, like this really should be part of you know, national disaster management processes. This is going to be harder in conflict settings, obviously, when governments are either the perpetrator or are you know not particularly accountable or transparent to their own populations. But there's still a need to think about how these collective approaches link to governments. And finally, the approach needs to be contextually relevant and inclusive. So it needs to be able to not just kind of helicopter a system in, but make sure that it is actually responding to what's on the ground. So especially in conflict contexts, the need to be sort of aware of what actors exist, who you're engaging with, and to be conflict sensitive. And finally, to make sure that the collective is inclusive, and that if you're building feedback systems for the response or building complaints mechanisms for the response, that they have entry points for the most vulnerable. So making sure that women and girls are included effectively, that people with disabilities are included effectively, and this is again often a main gap. I'll leave it there, as I think I'm out of time. The last thing I wanted to flag is one thing that we didn't see, and I'll be really interested to see where the discussion on this is really strong evidence of affected populations being directly involved in these approaches and actually being able to directly have a say in forums. So we see these collective approaches as really important to make responses more responsive. But in terms of that direct participation and that handing over the power, it's potentially more of a bridging point, and that needs to happen with other things involved. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Oliver, and thanks for concluding. Although, as mentioned, there wasn't really a deep analysis with regards to the extent to which affected communities or affected people are meaningfully engaging in decisions and around preparedness and response efforts by the system. So thank you for highlighting this critical point. But you've covered quite a lot of issues. So thank you for walking us through the critical barriers that you've seen through your research, again, including around barriers with regards to a shared understanding of what collective AAP means. You mentioned the importance of the buy-in and commitment of leadership, both globally, but also importantly at the field and operational level, and not only the humanitarian coordinators, but also the leadership of the humanitarian country team and key stakeholders on the ground. That's absolutely critical. The importance of localization, and thank you for highlighting this, because I always believe that without AAP and without appropriate engagement of local actors, we'll always struggle in terms of addressing effectively and efficiently the needs of communities, vulnerable communities on the ground. And last but not least is the issue of funding, dedicated funding, sustained funding, and the role of donors to make sure that we move the pendulum around our commitment to AAP. And thank you also for highlighting the fact that there's a lot. We already have the ingredients for success. And you walked us also through some ideas to address these barriers and capitalize on the infrastructure, I would say, that we have in place to make sure that we are much more accountable collectively to affected people. And I hear you loud and clear in terms of capitalizing on what we already have in place, rather than building new processes or systems that may be cumbersome and may not serve the purpose that we're all aiming for. So maybe with that, I'd like to actually turn to Vasiti. Once again, Vasiti is the director of the NDMO in Fiji. Vasiti, thank you so much again for joining us today. So Vasiti, despite our localization commitments, and Oliver just again spoke to this issue as again one of the 4 barriers to our collective AAP commitments, The ODI study finds that, quote, local actors and governments are rarely considered in the design of collective approaches. So Vasiti, it would be really great in this case for you to share your experiences from Fiji, and where do you see the role of the government when it comes to AAP and our collective role to be more accountable to affected people. So over to you, please, Vasiti.
Thank you very much, moderator. For my update this evening, I'll start off by the cycle of disaster management and how the government actually does that approach. So from the mitigation side of disaster management cycle, the Fijian government, through our partners, and these are NGOs as well as civil society organizations, we conduct community-based disaster risk training across selected vulnerable communities in Fiji. These are communities that have been exposed to multiple cyclones, flooding, as well as landslide. So using our network and our partners, we conduct what we call a CBDRM training. So in that phase of mitigation, through that training, we develop what we call an emergency committee within the very own committee, or within the very own village or community. So the emergency committee, in the event of being trained, they are also being equipped with equipment that would allow them to mobilize early response should an event happen within the area of concern. So for mitigation, that's an area that the Fiji government is focusing on. In addition to that, we're looking at developing a disaster volunteer scheme in collaboration, again, with our close partners, to ensure that we not only address the needs of volunteers that support us during response, but also address those that support us during such training, as I just mentioned. For preparation, the Fijian government, through the support of partners again and respective ministries, we hold what we call a National Disaster Awareness Week, where we disseminate information to areas that have been vulnerable. Prior to the cyclone season, we conduct an operational readiness check across all ministries to ensure that government assets are ready for deployment in an event of imminent threat. And for the same reason, we also do media, media talks. We send out media pamphlets, etc., to the communities to inform them, in this case, of an upcoming cyclone season. So for this for the current cyclone season that we're in, we had gone out and do a very big media approach, talking to the public about the importance of preparedness. And this includes, simple things like putting extra nails to your roof to ensure that it's not blown away, putting extra strapping to ensure that your house is not affected, etc. So this information was not only pushed out to different media platforms, but also through our emergency structure, which allows the government to reach the community using our machinery. Informations were disseminated. Again, the Fiji government emergency structure, which gives the divisional commissioners the upper hand to mobilize response in an event of a disaster, reaching the community much faster than the national level. So this emergency structure over the years have proven to be very successful. So that is with regards to response. And when it comes to recovery, we normally do what we call an after-action review or post-cyclone recovery, where we collect or we speak to all our partners, including private sector, and we deliberate on what didn't go well. One of the lessons learned that we've brought from the recent disaster was how can we bring our NGOs and our private sector to be part of a response. So for TCASA, we did we called out for a NDMO certified partners, where we opened the doors to our all interested practitioners who wish to join government and reach out to the community to distribute or to attend to response. So in this after action review, we are also, through the process, we are now also reviewing our legal framework, our National Disaster Management Act. So the Act, as part of the current review, looks into inclusivity, looks into accessibility in the evacuation center, also takes into account, the different response and the different mechanisms that the government needs to play, including the private sector, which is becoming very prominent in our daily discussions. So within the disaster management cycle, those are just a few things that we do. Building on, and since this is specifically the forum for community-based, or the focus is on the people, we also are currently developing our CBDRM policy. In that policy, when we do training in the community, we have a training manual. So this training manual will continue to change as per the environment or as per the context of disaster change. So this just a nutshell of the government response to disaster management here in Fiji.